As you may know, my name is Lina, and I'm doing a PhD at the Sustainability Research Institute in the Faculty of Environment. My research has been about following a golden thread that we don't get to see very often, but we know it's there. It's a bit like the sun in Leeds, although the sun is out today, so you can't really trust the English weather, not even for a poor punchline when I'm presenting. Never mind. So my research has been about following the golden thread of energy as it weaves through our economies and our societies. But before getting into more detail into this golden thread, let me tell you how I got entangled in it. So I did my bachelor degree in economics, and for my final year project, I did an internship in Colombia's equivalent of the national grid. There, I realized how vital energy is for our day-to-day lives and for the normal functioning of our societies and our economies. However, I wasn't blind to the environmental impacts of our energy systems, so I decided to do a master's in ecological economics, where I could integrate my economic interest with my environmental concerns. These interests led me here to Leeds, and well, the rest is history. So what is this golden thread that I keep going on about? It's an analogy by the UN's former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He said, energy is the golden thread that connects social equity, economic growth, social equity, and environmental sustainability. This phrase struck me because I thought it was a really nice way to connect the environmental issues I'm concerned about with my research interests. More specifically, energy as this golden thread is what connects climate change with economic activity and human well-being. Let's look at each of these in turn. So, needless to say, I hope, environmental degradation in general and climate change in particular is the greatest challenge we as a species are facing today. The Earth's life support systems are at risk. And energy has historically been responsible for around 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. So in other words, the energy systems we developed since the Industrial Revolution have been the main drivers behind climate change. But it all hasn't been in vain. Energy has been key for economic growth as well as vital for development. So how can we think of ways to decouple the environmental impacts of our energy systems from the benefits it derives to our economies and societies? So my initial weavings of the golden thread were on the energy dependency of economies through the concept of energy return on energy invested, or EROI. In other words, how much energy do we have left for economic purposes after we've used some energy to extract it? As energy gets harder and harder to extract, for example through fracking, we end up using more energy and thus having less net energy for economic activities. This seems to be the tendency for all fossil fuels. However, there are only a limited amount of studies that have attempted to calculate this at a national level, where it's relevant for policy making. Therefore, I developed, together with some colleagues at my institute, a novel methodology for calculating national level EROI using multi-regional input-output data. We applied the methodology to the UK for the period 1997-2012, and we found that in fact the UK's EROI for fossil fuels has been steadily decreasing. This means that in the UK, we are investing the same amount of energy, but getting less energy out of the ground. We have been able to compensate this by increased imports. However, a declining EROI has consequences in terms of energy security, but perhaps more importantly, in highlighting a limitation, in addition to the obvious environmental one, of continuing to support our economies on fossil fuels. My more recent weavings of the golden thread have been on the energy dependency of human well-being. These weavings require the development of an original conceptual framework for which I use two specific concepts. The first one is energy services. We are not interested in the liters of diesel or the kilowatts-hour of electricity. We're not interested in energy itself. It is things like mobility or illumination what we actually care about when using energy. In other words, it's the energy services provided by energy which are important for us. But important for what? What do we define as important? Can we differentiate between what we want and what we need? This is where the second concept I used comes in. The Chilean philosopher Manfred Max Neff and the British academic Ian Gough have made some positive steps towards such a complex distinction. They argue that we have a core finite set of universal human needs, but the way we satisfy them through satisfiers is culturally specific. The question then becomes, do energy services contribute to well-being, and if so, how do they contribute to the satisfaction of human needs? And following the golden thread back to climate change, can we provide enough energy for everyone to live well, enough energy to satisfy everyone's needs without compromising our environment? Do these concepts open up new possibilities for decoupling? In order to answer these questions, I designed a participatory method and applied it in Medellin, Colombia in January this year. The fact that I'm originally from Medellin is of course pure coincidence. I consider the challenge of improving human well-being within environmental limits to be bigger in the developing world for two main reasons. There are much higher levels of inequalities, deprivation, and lack of access to modern energy services. But at the same time, if we are to remain within environmental limits, developing countries can't follow the same resource-intensive development path that countries that are already developed followed. From workshops I ran in an urban and a rural community, I found that energy services were very important for the well-being of the communities. In fact, if you read down the columns, all the analyzed human needs were considered to require at least one energy service as satisfier. Of course, some human needs, like affection and identity, required less energy services than others, like subsistence, protection, and participation, which were more energy service intensive. Conversely, reading across the rows, I also found that some energy services, like mobility and information and communication, were more important than others, like heating. Of course, how important a particular energy service is specific to each community's local context, in cultural, institution, physical, and so on, in those terms. I'm sure that if we did this sort of workshop in the UK, heating would be considered a much more central satisfier, especially this winter. The workshops also gave the communities the opportunity to think about alternative ways to provide a specific energy service, the one that they thought was more important. For example, the rural community thought of a community-run cable car as a mobility energy service to satisfy their need to move their agricultural produce from the farm to the road where it can be collected and further commercialized. This part of the workshop was particularly appreciated by the communities and the NGOs I was working with, because it empowered them to come up with self-reliant alternatives, and it opened the door for process replication in the future. So what's all this been for? The weaving around economic growth resulted in a first author published paper and 2 presentations at international conferences. Furthermore, it was also presented at a workshop with civil servants from the Government Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, showing that it has the potential to influence policy making. The weavings around human well-being have also sparked academic interest, resulting in 1 published paper and another paper accepted with minor revisions, both for author as well as 4 presentations at international conferences. Additionally, collaborating with my supervisor contributed to her winning a prestigious Leverhulme Leadership Award, which is partly looking at this weaving of energy and human well-being. Moreover, and more importantly, I believe that participatory work can be highly beneficial for the communities involved, and the conceptual framework and participatory method have the flexibility to recognize the local realities while still providing strong empirical results. Moving forward, I would like to continue in academia and continue to develop the potential impact of my PhD by continuing to weave this golden thread. In the case of the weavings around the economy, by expanding the boundary of analysis and carrying it out for more countries and more years, as well as to continue its diffusion amongst national energy policy-making spheres. And in the case of the weavings around human well-being, I would like to continue to work with communities from other countries, as well as presenting my results to different levels of decision-making. Given the urgency of our current environmental crisis, I believe that further weavings in this direction are key, since efforts to tackle environmental problems without tackling social justice problems are doomed to fail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lina. Over to the panel. Do you have a question from the panel members while you writing as ever going on? We have some quietness. Yes.
So you did hint at this in your presentation, but it would be great if you could say a bit more about how the local context obviously massively changes our perception of what our needs or our, our desires are in relation to some of those uses of energy. So heating was a really good example where that may be massively important or not important at all. Okay, so could you say whether, you said you might look at other places. So what other places would you use as other points of comparison, and how might that change the outcome of the study?
Yeah, so I would like to look at countries that have different levels of well-being measured in these kind of needs, but also different levels of environmental impact. So, for example, if you looked at the UK, we would have higher levels of well-being, but also higher levels of environmental impact. And then start to see if there are certain things that can be generalizable. So if, for example, mobility ends up being an energy service that is particularly important for the human needs, regardless of the context, then that could be an area where policy interventions could be prioritized, but also then really interestingly would be to look at these cultural specificities. And yeah, so I think I would like to study countries kind of within that spectrum, in countries in, so for example, the UK would be high well-being outcomes with high environmental impacts. Colombia would be like medium well-being outcomes with low environmental impacts, but also, for example, low environmental impacts, low well-being outcomes. There's also countries which have very high environmental impacts with very low well-being outcomes. So just, and then, in that space, and then kind of tease out the generalizable aspects, but also the things that are definitely down to cultural specificity.
Thank you.
Any further panel questions? No? Okay, we do have a couple of minutes if there's a question in the audience anyway. The audience has gone quiet now. He didn't expect me to ask if there's a question. Okay, I think we shall leave it there. Thank you very much, Lina. Thank you.